Alright, so I've seen a lot of videos, newspaper articles saying that, oh no, the US government can't pay back its debt. We're like only $34 trillion in debt. But I'm here to present an opposite case. I'm going to argue that the US doesn't need to pay the people back, but we still do. Alright, so here's some context for those who do not enjoy the freedoms of America. We are in $34 trillion in debt, and it's still rising. We've been running continuous budget deficits for a long time, so we make about $3 to $4 trillion in tax revenues, but we spend like $5 or $6 trillion above that. So the question is it bad? Now let's take an example here. Let's say this fictitious nation has $100 in debt and pays $5 per year in interest. 1 year later, they still have the same $100 in debt and $5 in interest. But we might note that there's a 10% inflation rate. I purposely chose this terrible color scheme to hurt your eyes. And that's what people feel like when they look at the $34 trillion in debt. But what should really hurt your eyes is the fact that the nation is just kind of scamming the people who own this debt. Because if there is a 10% inflation rate, the debt should really be $110 and the interest should fairly be adjusted at $5.50. But obviously that's not how the world works. The debt does not adjust with inflation. So in reality, while they're just paying back with deflated dollars, they're paying back with money that's worth less. So in essence, we're actually saving money by having inflation. And that's the main reason why the US can get away with having $34 trillion in debt. As long as their debt craze doesn't go too crazy and we have a reasonable inflation rate, your debt over time goes down. Because while the value of your debt remains fixed, the tax revenues will benefit from the inflation as you'll bring in more and more money. So let's look at an inflation rate of 10%. Let's say revenues are $1,000, but the debt is $2,000. So we might imagine this as a 2-to-1 ratio to debt to revenue. However, if you look at this chart, if the debt was somehow remaining constant, but the revenue kept growing because of the 10% inflation rate, by the 8th year, we have actually improved our ratio from 2-to-1 to 0.93. In fact, this nation didn't have to do anything. All it had to do was just keep an inflation rate of 10% and a reduced debt to revenue ratio. So the conclusion is the government can increase debt as long as inflation exists. Now, even with a reasonable inflation rate, maybe you say 10%, that's Jimmy Carter, that's Joe Biden inflation rates, but we're talking about 2 to 4%, which many economists assume is a very reasonable inflation rate. Well, let's take that number. If I bought a government bond, right, and held it for 10 years, or no, in fact, we're not even going to hold government bonds because we don't trust the government here. We instead hold just dollar bills. If I hold $1, in 10 years, the value could decrease between 19 to 33%. Of course, inflation rates fluctuate every year. Maybe 1 year is 3%, 1 year is 4%, but there's no denying the fact 20% at minimum is still quite a bit of money. And that has big implications. Because if I was, let's say, holding that aforementioned bond earlier, and let's say I got $100 in interest fixed, by the 10th year, my real value is actually just $80, even though I'm still receiving $100. On top of that, given that the US currency is a fiat currency, meaning it's not backed by any commodity, we can just kind of print how much money we ever want. On top of that, we have a massive tax base. I mean, the US economy is pretty powerful. And on top of that, because we're the reserve currency, the conclusion is America can do whatever it wants, just probably get away with it. I mean, we did this plenty of times. Now, some of you may argue, well, the US will never, ever, ever print money. But let's be real here. If desperate times really do call for desperate measures, the US can do whatever it wants. After all, we own our own currency. It's not like we have to ask for permission from anybody to print our own currency. We can do it ourselves. Will that hurt the rest of the world? Yes. But the US would fight another day.